You're listening to the OnePeterFive podcast.
It is a real joy for us to welcome you all here. Habemus Papam.
Rebuilding Catholic culture, restoring Catholic tradition.
Hello and welcome to the OnePeterFive podcast, episode number 60. I'm Steve Skojak. Today, our show is about the journey to deepening faith. It's about growing up Catholic in a world that makes that very hard. It's about nominal Catholicism and how it lets so many of us slip away, at least for a time, until somehow, by God's grace, we're pulled back into the heart of the church. It's about where the journey to worship God the best that we can, to become the best Catholics that we can, to become the most virtuous men that we can, where that leads us. My guest today is a man who grew up a cultural Catholic, left for a while for a number of reasons, and then ultimately wound up coming back in stages. And as his faith deepened, his journey took him to different places. And it's a very interesting story because now he has found himself very unexpectedly at the traditional Latin Mass. It wasn't what he was necessarily looking for, and he still kind of has his feet in both worlds. He still goes to another parish as well, but he is coming to recognize that he just wants to give God the best that he can, and he wants to be the best father he can, and he wants to lead his family the best that he can. And he doesn't necessarily want to understand all of the theological arguments for everything. He's just a normal guy who just wants to live his faith. So I met him at our parish, and after a number of conversations we've had after Mass about things, we've realized there's a lot of conversation here that's sort of being left on the cutting room floor. There are a lot of Catholics that are living in the Novus Ordo parish world that are either interested in or coming over to the traditional Mass. There are a lot of traditional Catholics that either have forgotten what it was like to be that way, because most of us, let's be honest, grew up with the new Mass. And don't necessarily know how to interface with those people who are now, because of everything that's going on in the church, really starting to show up at our Masses. And how do we bring them in, and how do we make them feel like they're a part of our community? So there's a lot of those conversations that we're having offline. Today, we thought we'd have them online with you. So I don't want to spend any time monologuing here. I want to get right to the conversation. I think it's a good one. I think you'll enjoy it. I have to apologize. There are some audio issues that we're going to do our best cleaning up. But, the nature of technology is that sometimes these recordings don't go exactly according to plan. But I hope that you stick with it despite the technical glitches, because this is a really worthwhile episode. And I think you're going to get a lot out of it. So I'll be back with my friend Kenny Tamargo right after this. Do you love OnePeterFive? Do you want to join in our fight? Go to OnePeterFive.com/donate today. Thank you for your support.
You're listening to the OnePeterFive podcast.
Joining me now to discuss the joys and challenges of conversion to a more authentic Catholic life in the 21st century, and about building real bridges, not the James Martin SJ kind, between traditionalists and people in the mainstream Catholic parishes, is my friend Kenny Tamargo. Kenny, thanks for coming on to talk about this.
Hey, Steve. Thanks for having me.
So I want to start by kind of introducing the audience to you a little bit. You're not an author or a professor or some kind of professional Catholic. You're not a grifter. You're not a member of Trad Inc. Nope. But you are a guy who I met at my parish who is very involved in his faith and who I think has a very interesting and important story to tell. And it's a story about the sort of journey that you've taken from kind of a nominal lapsed Catholicism to being a guy who's really fired up about his faith and wants to help others dive in as well. Would you say that's a fair assessment of where you are?
That's a very fair assessment. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. That's how I got this beautiful French accent. I grew up in an Irish Catholic family. My dad and mom were Sunday mass. The whole neighborhood. I think I knew one Jewish kid, but everybody else, to me at least, was Catholic. Within like a 5-block radius. And then we had like 3 different parishes in that that area. The one we went to was built in 1970, so we went to the modern church of that time.
Gotcha.
We went every Sunday. I mean, I was there up until, and at grade school, I went to Catholic grade school.
So you went to Catholic grade school. You're getting this Catholic formation. It's, would you say it's a kind of a cultural Catholicism? I mean, so what are the years we're talking about here?
So I was born in 1970, and I started the grade school. I was about, I want to say it was about 1980 of that Catholic school. It was, in my house, it wasn't just cultural. My dad grew up in the church himself, and he grew up, I always think of his story as like that black and white movie, Going My Way, Bing Crosby type of Catholicism.
Yeah.
He grew up in Brooklyn, and, he had all the bells and whistles. My mom was born in Ireland, so she brought her Irish culture into the faith as well, into our home. So it wasn't uncommon for her to be praying the rosary, but it wasn't something we did collectively in the house. We knew about the rosary. We didn't laugh at tradition or we didn't laugh at the church. Actually, we started laughing at some of the folk singers and stuff, my sister and I, that we would get on Sunday mornings that kind of popped up. And I would say that was probably mid to late 70s that I start remembering. 7 years old, it was 77. So that's when we started recognizing these folk singers and some of the silliness that my words, silliness of the faith that really started giving me question marks.
Yeah, so 77, which is when I come on the scene, and from that point on, it's crazy, right? I mean, it's felt banners from there on out for a long time.
Yeah, definitely.
So you're going to Catholic school, are you getting an education? Are you getting a Catholic education, or are you learning about Martin Luther King and Gandhi? I mean, what's going on at the Catholic school?
So, man, I could break this down. I need a whole session just for this. My mom put me over there, I think it was 3rd or 4th grade, and the principal who just started to integrate the boys and girls school. So now they're starting to integrate the classes. And that was the year I went in. The principal that was in charge of the girls' school, and that's kind of what they called it at the time, the girls' school. The principal at the time was really one of the pantsuit, short haircut, very, very kind of rough, humble type of woman. And I remember when I first came in from public school to this first day of Catholic school, she pulled me into the hallway and read me the riot act and told me that she's not going to put up with my nonsense. But it wasn't the loving sister that you would be used to in a church. She was hardcore. She was like a gym teacher. So I immediately, I don't want to get confusing, but the church I went to was a very modern church. But the school I went to was probably 2 miles away from my house. And that's a lifetime in Brooklyn. But if you go, I went to this church now, and that school had had the traditions. It was 100 years old by the time I had gotten there. So the church was in the classic style. So there was a lot of mystery to the church that was really being ripped out. I know, for example, the altar rails were torn out of this school church. It was gigantic. It was almost like a cathedral size. And they had removed these rails, and they had removed all the real nice art and started laying up some of that Art Deco type of look of Catholicism that it took on. So there's a lot of visual and a lot of signs that I had that really raised some deep questions about what's going on with the faith. Because I want to remind you, my dad always boasted about the old church, the priest doing ad orientem or a whole Latin mass, and that raised a lot of questions. But he didn't reveal the answers. He didn't know the theology at that point, let's say.
Okay, so he has these fond memories of the way things were. Did he kind of grit his teeth at the way Mass was when you guys were kids growing up?
No, but I'm going to say that he probably liked the relaxation of some of the restrictions.
Sure.
He liked maybe the loosening of the Lenten, or the fasting on Fridays, which never really happened. But I think both of them enjoyed maybe just a loosening of the church, at least their perception of what the church was trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are legitimate things there. I mean, the communion fast being 12 hours, including water. I'm a mouth breather at night. Let's be honest. I got to drink water constantly throughout the night. There's no way I'd ever receive the Eucharist if that was a thing. So, I mean, I can kind of get, Orthodox Catholics being like, hey, I'm on board with changing a couple of these things. But, okay, so you're in this school. It's kind of hardcore. And then you experience over the period of time of your education kind of a drift away from the church. You want to talk about that?
Sure. So just to kind of fall back onto what we were talking about, I was an altar boy at that church. There were some of the older priests that were retiring, and there was these new modern priests that were coming in, and they were really they were cool in a way. They talked about rock bands and things like that, and we kind of thought that was interesting. So there was definitely you were starting to see the infection. I guess I started recognizing it and having almost like a street sense that this isn't exactly, this guy may be cool, but he's uncomfortably cool, if that is something.
Yeah, it's like that Steve Buscemi meme. Hello, fellow kids. He's walking with a skateboard over his shoulder. Yeah, but he's like 45.
It's exactly yeah. And that was really it. And, this is the height of the 80s. This is between, this is before 85, 86. I think I graduated in 84, 85. So there was a lot of sex abuse there. And it was kind of obvious. So there was one priest in particular that would wait outside the church when school released. And we would all go over and hang out with him, and he was one of the cool priests. But what we didn't, until he could groom certain men, certain boys, he would take them to a cabin he had. He had a place in Pennsylvania, and he was, from what we understand, taking photos of them. So he would take photos of them, inappropriate photos. And it was all under the disguise of an Indian burial ground that he lived on. The house was on, so it was haunted. So he always had this mystique, and boys wanted to go up and see this Indian burial ground, and then they came home. But they always came home, and they never really. You expected Joy to tell you how the weekend went, and they never really had much to talk about. They were very quiet about it. So we knew. Because guys did talk about it, older guys that now were telling their younger brothers stay away from him or whatever. There was conversations, so we kind of knew the word on the street was this, So people learned about who to stay away from and not. There were so many loving priests that were there at that time, so it was a hard contrast to really work between.
Okay, so how does this contribute to you saying, I don't know if I really want to continue doing this Catholic thing?
So I always loved the Catholic faith. It was cool. It had history, The problem is that when I was in my formative years, there was none of that. It was really, that's when the banners were coming out. What I believe to be, when you heard about saints and you heard about some of the things they've done and how they were martyred, we couldn't connect the dots because the priests that would evangelize and speak about the truth of the faith, they were going away. They were disappearing because this new generation of priests were coming in. So even when we learned in school, I had one sister that taught us in fourth grade. Habit, very, very traditional Catholic sister. And she did probably the best she could. But then the following year, lay people who really were embracing Vatican II. And all the while, you weren't being catechized properly enough. I guess that's probably the easiest way. I wasn't being catechized, and all the things I loved about the church were slipping away physically, right? And there was no attraction towards wanting to, could not imagine why you would want to be a priest and all that stuff. Did I answer that?
I mean, kind of, sort of, in a way. I mean, so you say you don't, you couldn't imagine why you wanted to be a priest, and things were sort of slipping away. But this had been, I mean, sort of the cultural and religious framework of your whole life. Your parents were both religious. You go to Catholic schools, and then you graduate from school, and you're like, I mean, how do you get to the point where you say, I don't know if this is really true, and I don't know if I really want to live this?
So I don't know if I ever actually, I know I had those problems. I know I had, I didn't trust the faith for what it was. Where the old faith, right, the one pre-1970, before I was born, that one was, that was kind of legitimate. But the one I was in they were painting a whole different picture. And it wasn't nearly as bad as it is now. So I'm trying to control what I say about that because I don't want to exaggerate what I was witnessing. But like I mentioned before about my principal, the sisters were no longer wearing habits. They were all dressed like businessmen, like Hillary Clinton.
Yeah. Pantsuits.
Exactly, pantsuits, and there was no love. It was all anger in the schools. As a matter of fact,
what do you think they were angry about? I'm curious. I mean, what do you think they were angry about?
I don't know, because the new priests, they were excited about this new evangelization. I don't understand, but there wasn't a whole lot. I know that we had a math teacher that was a sister, and then she wasn't anymore, and she was an older woman. And then we had, every once in a while you would see sisters that would come by, and maybe they were just staying there while they were doing. It's really kind of patchy. But the interesting side note was the boys' school that we had. There was a principal there, and he was one of the singers in "Jesus Is a Friend of Mine." So if you've ever heard that song, my principal's in that video, and that was like an album that they played at my school, like it was the greatest thing in the world. So, I mean, I should have brought that up from the beginning. I wouldn't have to explain any of this.
So basically, I mean, what I'm hearing is it just became something that became very difficult to continue to take seriously. Is that correct?
Yeah, the mystery of the faith and what encapsulates at least the boys' drive to want to be a part of this faith. None of it existed when I was younger. When I was an altar boy, we had the traditional Catholics, but that other church, they went to the white one with the tie, the sash and stuff.
Yeah.
So all the mystery of the faith was going away. There was no reason, the confusion was there. And when you would ask a question, I remember being shot down a lot. I remember in 5th grade asking, the teacher brought up the Christmas wreath and it being circular like God's life, never starting and never ending. And I remember being kind of blown away in 5th grade, and I tried to ask another question about it, and she shot me down like I was being a clown. But it was serious, almost a serious theological question that she could have answered in a simple way for a 5th grader.
Yeah.
But she really just didn't want to get into that part of the.
I mean, look, that was a thing even a decade before. My dad, I have young parents. My dad was in school in the 60s. He was born in 52. he said that the reason he wound up leaving the church was because he would ask these questions, about theology or whatever, and he'd get this answer: "How dare you? How dare you ask this question?"
Sure.
And he said,
it might have been a little softer on my end.
But it was basically the sense of like, well, if you're not going to take seriously that I have these questions, why should I? I mean, you don't have any answers for any of this stuff. And I think
it did.
Yeah. And I think by the time, you're experiencing this thing, it's not as harsh. It's not the habited nun with the cliched ruler, but it's basically like, whatever. I mean, I don't know. I don't have answers for you. Why are you asking me this, kid? Okay, so
that's hold on. That example you did with the harsh nun, that never played out in my life, as far as the ones in the habits.
Yeah, I think they were done by then.
They were never the strict ones. It was the other one. So I always remember thinking
it was the butch haircut and the pantsuit that was the harsh one.
Exactly. I mean, they needed like a gym whistle. So yeah, it was very difficult because I remember, and I mentioned it earlier, trying to navigate going to confession, especially in my formative years, like during puberty, when you're going into confession and you're starting to confess mortal sin.
Yeah.
And you would choose which line to get in depending on the year the priest was ordained. So now you wouldn't go to the Monsignor or some of the older priests. You would go and take the easy road, unless you found an older priest that was deaf, possibly. But usually you went to the younger one that was just, don't be so hard on yourself. And they started converting, the confessional into the reconciliation room.
So, I mean, were they saying things? I mean, so I can get the appeal of going to a priest who is like, hey, it's good that you're back. Yeah, this is a sin, but you got to keep working on it, blah, 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 versus this isn't really a sin. I mean, which thing are you getting in these lines?
You're getting the latter, the part of don't be so hard on yourself. We all do that, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, that definitely was a part of the discouragement. Now, also, I was already a troublemaker. So I was already creating trouble in my own life outside of the church. I'm arguing almost right now that if it had been solid, I'd have been able to have been drawn back into a moral life, because by the time I was done at 8th grade, I was done mentally. I mean, there was a confirmation. We did our confirmation at, 14, 15? And I had already written it, said, this is the last thing I'm doing. This is all I need to do just to satisfy my parents. But I'd already checked out and already started creating some of those cliches. Why do I have to confess my sins to another man? And all of those things started growing inside of me.
The guy in the box. The guy in the box.
Exactly. Yeah. So by the time go on. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, okay, so, you drift away from the church at this point because you don't take it seriously. These new priests are, trying to be cool, but they're not. It's the Hank Hill thing about, you're not making, I don't know the quote exactly, but it's like, you're not making Christianity better, you're making rock music worse, kind of a thing. The abuse stuff that's going on, you're seeing it happen. You're worried this priest is taking people out to cabins. So you're basically what at this point? An agnostic, a hedonist? Where does it take you?
I don't think I'm agnostic, because even I always believed in God. At one point, I assumed that he was giving me a pass in a way. I started creating my own understanding of what God was. And I find that's what a lot of people that I talk to from my past in that grade, people from the old neighborhood, when I talk to them, that is kind of the route. If I talk to someone that walked away from the church, usually the route is that, that they they just walked away from the church because it wasn't giving them, it wasn't feeding me, you know. And there's some truth to that saying, even though. So a lot of times you'll hear in a priest's homily in the regular Novus Ordo Mass some of these, you know, buzzwords, I guess. And there's some truth to what they're saying, but there's also a lot of truth to what they're ignoring as well. And one of them is like, I'm not getting anything from the Mass. Well, if you hadn't been taught correctly what the Mass is about, and there's no understanding of the Mass, then yeah, the Mass is going to be boring because you have no clue what's going on. And those were the questions that really, by the time I was going into high school, those were all those questions. All those questions had built up to a point that I could no longer, had to tip out of the church because I had too many unanswered questions. And that's where just the confusion just got so strong that's where I was at that point in my life.
Okay, so you graduate from high school. I don't recall if you said you went to college or not, but you know, you're in your 20s. What is life like at this point, and then what draws you back?
Yeah, my life was a mess after grade school. I in and out of high school. I spent a lot of time working. So I worked in some areas outside of my neighborhood. I did a lot of growing up, and not the good kind. I started experimenting with drugs and alcohol, probably early on, 15, around that age. And by the time I was 21, 22, I think 22, I started bartending. And that was going to be my path. That's where I was at that time period. So I had done a lot of cooking and a lot of worked in delis and worked for a lot of food service places, and then kind of transitioned into bartending. And then by the time that, you know, from 22, I really was on almost like a leaving Las Vegas type of lifestyle, just until I was about 28. And I was completely detached from the church, with the exception of funerals and weddings. I had never been into a church unless one of those two things were going on. So I lived a completely hedonistic life. I was outside of normal conversations about any type of religion or anything. I spoke among other people that were doing the same thing, most likely. And there was just a lot of confusion at that point because now I'm completely removed and there was no interest to know the truth. It was just a defense of why I was comfortable where I was in my theology, because I started developing my own specific God that fit what I was doing and didn't hurt what I was doing to continue on. You know, I don't know how else to put that. He just was cookie cutter God. He just fit in that one box. Yeah. That told me this is why you don't go. You know, Jesus was like John Lennon. You know, yeah. I started developing that type of idea that he just wants us all to be happy, and pretty much the modernists. So I guess the modernists won up until that point. But by the time I was 28, I made an abrupt stop with drinking and drugs. So I had gone into, you know, started attending meetings because I needed to stop. And I tried a couple of different routes and none of them, they only made it worse. So when I did stop, I went to these meetings and they started introducing God back into the lexicon. My conversations all had to do with a higher power. And I think they all did what they were traditionally intended to do, those type of meetings. And they leveled you out and just pulled your jets a little bit. And as I was drying out and cleaning myself up, I would pause a little more and start noticing some of the gifts that were returning back into my life. And I didn't attribute it to my doing, but to God. So in the past, coming home at 5 a.m. and the birds are chirping, it's disaster. This is ridiculous. But now that I'm in sobriety, birds chirping is God's way of saying good morning to me. And I started having this more positive outlook on life. The thing that brought me back into the church, which is the killer, is when I met my wife. My wife came from a Catholic home, different story than mine completely as far as education. I assume that she probably has a lot of similarities that she was witness to, but her family stayed grounded, and my wife in her 20s still was going to Mass. She didn't miss Sunday Mass. So kind of a prerequisite for me to have a continued relationship with her was to start attending Masses again. But I still had some dirty laundry that I needed to air out. And at this point, there was a priest in our life that growing up was a neighborhood kid. He was probably the only person that went to seminary in our neighborhood that continued on and became a priest. And he was rational, intellectual, spent his time in Rome. He was an Italian guy, so all the Italians loved him. But he was someone you could sit down with and have a conversation with about the faith, and he would put it into a clearer perspective. He's still heading. He's really a warrior, and he's even one of the stronger warriors because now you see the church, you see all these seminarians. They've got reinforcements. This guy was a soul survivor. He was navigating the politics of New York Diocese and still holding the faith strong. He was put in an Italian neighborhood in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and he was restoring some of the traditions that they had done and holding strong to the faith. So a lot of us gravitated towards him. And at the time when I sat down with him, he was at a school, and that's where he is still to this day. He's moving to different schools, and he's really running seminaries, and he's doing a great job. So I set up an appointment with him, and I just had a list of questions. I had a list of grievances also that I wanted to just unload. And I think we might have done 3 or 4 hours together. And he offered if I wanted to do more time, and I just kind of felt content because you got to remember, I wasn't catechized very much. I ran out of questions. But he had done what he needed to do. God put him in my life because I could return back to the regular Mass and not grumble about silly things like baskets and music and stuff like that. So I returned to the church regularly. Okay, so I'm going to fast forward. So let's say 1998, I returned to the church. 2005, I moved to Arizona. All the while between that, we were going on and off to church. By the time Sue and I got married, I think we started skipping a couple of Sundays here and there. We didn't think it was a mortal sin. It was no big deal. But when we moved to Arizona, we moved on our own. And we said from the first weekend we got here, we're going every Sunday. And we did. And we found a really cool modern church. It had all the bells and whistles. It's shaped like a stadium. The priest was really, he was really what you would expect a pastor to be in a modern church like that. And we sat and we listened. And we listened a lot more. And then somewhere, I think it was 2010, we did a Crucio. And the Crucio lit a spark because now we started to research what was going on in the Mass. And we started, I'm sorry, I can back up a little. We had friends that were Christian, non-denominational, that would ask us really some of those, Mary questions and stuff. You guys pray to Mary and stuff. And honestly, she and I did not know the answers to these questions, but we had to Google, we had internet.
Yeah.
So they would ask the questions and we would write them down. And then we would Google them and get the answer and then say, hey, make a phone call, and we would answer those questions. Now, this this went on, and the whole thing was we were learning from these answers. So I remember being blown away at the lineage of Peter. That I was like, wait a minute, they're all connected. Like I'd never really thought about that. So I remember being really started cementing my faith in that respect. But with this study, also caused confusion because the church I was attending was kind of slipping some of the things by. I mean, weird things like no confiteor and stuff like that. I started.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I mean, and this is the thing. I was formed the same way, indirectly. I was a very sort of computer nerdy kind of kid, and I would get on these local bulletin board systems. It was a local dial-up thing that you'd get on, and there were people on there, and there would be discussions about religion. And I was 15, 16. It was in the early 90s, and these atheists and stuff would be attacking the faith. And the reason that I learned anything about my faith at that point in time was because these guys were attacking it. I'm like, hey, I'm an altar boy. I mean, this is my thing. This is what I'm doing, right? And again, I'm 14, 15 at this point. And so I start going to the bookshelves, in my family's house, and I'm pulling the books and I'm looking stuff up, and you start learning about this stuff because at the time, even Google didn't exist. And it was, how do I answer these questions? How do I deal with these attacks on the faith? But it makes you start confronting stuff that you'd never thought about before. So it's kind of an interesting thing where it's like you really learn the faith best when you're having to defend it. I think that's a thing that happens. So you're at this parish, and you got this, I think you described him to me in the past as sort of a little bit of a Father James Martin sort of priest, and then you've got these Christian friends who are asking these questions. I mean, it makes you dig. And then when you dig, you find stuff that you don't expect.
Yeah, so I started looking on the internet for simple Catholic questions that I did not know the answers to. But now that I was being asked, I needed those answers. So it was simple ones like, we pray to Mary, that the wine and bread was not blood and flesh, obviously. So it really started.
People are challenging you, saying it doesn't really turn into.
Well, yeah, anything, because the two people that really and they're still friends of ours. They just left the Catholic faith early in their life and joined a non-denominational, and they started raising these questions, wanting us to join a non-denominational, but we were pretty content with the Catholic faith, innocently, really, because honestly, I don't know. It had to have been the Holy Ghost. There had to have been some interaction, because we navigated some very strange times that we could have intersected and moved into a non-denominational. One of them, for example, was that priest I mentioned. The Mormons came by the house and started talking to my wife, and my wife was open to talk to them. And I called my priest just back in New York. Hey, get a heads up. Who are these Mormon people? I didn't know anything about. And man, he blew a gasket, and he started preparing me for battle. And I never ever heard a priest talk to me like this. And what he was saying was they're trying to get my wife going, to move her in that direction, so then I would shift over. And then he sent me Matthew Kelly's Rediscovering Catholicism. And I got to admit, man, it blew up in our hands. It really started driving us closer and closer towards Christ's intention for us in the church. Then we were
from the mouths of theological babies like Matthew Kelly.
It you know what? And you're right. There's a simplicity that he offers that really tickles the ears, and he does it in such a way that he teaches you some really nuggets in the faith. But he was a tool that I needed at that time. And I have no regrets about that. We went. We had friends that invited us on a crucio. So a crucio is like a 3-day, 4-day retreat. You spend the night, you stay over, and they unwrap the Catholic Church, the faith, and they unwrap, what you're supposed to be doing in your life within the church or whatever. And it's really a kind of a jumping off point for people that are excited about the faith. And I think it comes from more of a charismatic direction.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of things that they were doing up, and I don't want to unwrap them, but what I will say is that it was the first time that it was evident to me that there were masculine men in the faith that loved the faith. And it sounds kind of wrong, but it was the first time there was men that were effeminate telling me about the faith.
And I mean, it doesn't sound wrong at all. We all need those guys. I mean, guys.
Yeah, but up until that age, I mean, 2010, I was 40.
Yeah.
Up until that age, I hadn't witnessed it. At least I've seen it in my life with friends' parents and stuff like that. But collectively, talking about praying the rosary, those things, and none of that existed in my life up until that point. So that really kind of set us on fire, but also started having me unwrap some more theological questions that I had. Pope Benedict was Pope at the time, so they were doing the changes in the church, and I really had no clue what they were talking about. Sacrosanctum Concilium and all these different Latin phrases started hitting me, and I really kind of just put them on the back burner. But what I did notice was that the priest that was at this really cool hip church that I went to, he was digging in his heels. And I didn't understand what was going on, but now I know that Pope Benedict was making changes, and this priest was really not happy with some of the Latin that was returning, and some of the traditions of the past were starting to be accepted back into the modern day, and this priest was upset. That I know through conversations with him, and he brought in a statue of here's an interesting one. He brought in a statue of Pope John the 23rd holding a copy of Sacrosanctum Concilium. So when I learned about that, so when I saw this guy, I said, "All right, who's this big guy?" I had no clue who he was. So I look him up, and then I say, "Wait a minute, this guy started, but he wasn't there for the end of it. Why is he holding it?" Like there was no letter, there was no Sacrosanctum Concilium. So why is he holding
and for
it?
people trying to keep score at home who don't know the term Sacrosanctum Concilium, this was the Second Vatican Council's document on the liturgy, which was created and exploited by Archbishop Annibale Bugnini, who later used it to create the Novus Ordo Mass. But it was, John the 23rd, as you said, didn't live through the council. He didn't see the conclusion of these documents.
Yeah, there was that. So some of these confusing things, it sound better than my youth. There were some questions that I had when I was younger. These were getting more complex. The questions were becoming adult questions. I started settling some of the old stuff, and now I started on this whole new path. What happened was, I guess, the real spark that set me over the edge was that I was raised in New York, old churches. I was raised in old buildings, and regardless of how much change they put on them, you could not change the echoes. You could not change some of the tradition is stuck in the walls.
That is a beautiful, beautiful thought. And I know what you mean, because we used to go to an old church in D.C. that was built in the 1800s, and there's just something about it.
It's there, and when you walk, you hear it echo, and you smell it in the confessional, and the wood. They're not replacing the pews, so the smells and the bells, man. And that I heard those phrases, and And those things really started to come to light because now in Arizona, and of course, remember, from Brooklyn, people are grabbing their hands on the Our Father and they're like, what are you doing? Get out of here.
Yeah,
Really?
exactly. And it's the youngest state. I mean, it's the youngest state in the country, of the continental states. And, what is it, 1918, 1916? I forget when Arizona. I mean, there's a lot of new here, right? I mean,
yeah.
It doesn't have the history that New York has.
I think our diocese was started in the 70s. If it wasn't 1970, I mean, I think we just celebrated the 50-year anniversary. So I think it was 69.
Wow. I didn't even know that.
So it established then, and these churches exist, and there's a lot of touching in Arizona. There's a lot of hand-holding and a lot of raising and a lot of lifting that, man, it just really set me back. Like I remember at one point, my wife and I would get up with my son during the Our Father, and we would go out into the vestibule because we knew that was the hand-holding time.
Yeah.
Then we would return back to our seats afterwards.
No, I've done exactly the same thing. I'm like, I don't even want to have to explain it to anybody. I'm going to go to the bathroom.
Yeah, it's just really evident here when we grew up in those older churches. So it could be happening. And, keep in mind, I was gone from the late 80s to almost 2000. And that's when I started seeing really these radical changes, altar girls, a lot more, it used to be all of my friends' dads, ushers. I'm starting to see a lot of women and a lot of girls, and the music got hipper and cooler. It was still the same, and the music was catchy and the words were there, but the thing is that I remember the words cutting a little deeper when I was a kid. Salve Regina and things like that. We sang as kids in the old church. Like I mentioned, that fourth grade teacher, she was teaching us. She was really doing her work. That's this sister, and she really pounded into us the faith. So whatever remnants were still in there existed when I got older, and when I got here, it was really kind of like everything just stood out to me. Everything that was new about the church.
So in the past couple of years, that sort of epiphany that you had, you said it was around 2010.
Yeah.
It sort of blossomed and matured, and you take an even deeper dive, right? I mean, you wind up going to the traditional Latin Mass at the fraternity parish here in Phoenix, which is where we met. I don't know when you start going there or why, but I see you there. I noticed you before I met you, kind of standing alone in the back, looking like you were figuring stuff out. I mean, how did you wind up making that step?
Very interesting. So I have at that time I had a son and a daughter, and he was all boy at a different church other than the one I just mentioned. And that church was a lot more reverent. It was priests from Africa. I think they're the Apostles of Jesus, and they put the tabernacle back in the center. And it was an older, more modest church. The income of the other one was really out through the roof. A lot of people donated to that church. They paid off their mortgage. This other church that we went to was a lot more modest. But what happened was that modern church got too tough for me. There was a couple of things that happened. The priest there, the pastor that was there, I just didn't see eye to eye with. And I started really having these theological questions that at that point, I wasn't sure what was going on. So we moved into this other church, which was more traditional, but still modern looking. And, and I hate to generalize it, but there's an older crowd there at this different church.
Wait, are you saying it's a boomer parish?
I am. I don't want to go down the boomer road.
No, we can pretend like we're going to edit that out later. We're going to pretend.
Yes, yeah. So it is. It is a church that I decide that I'm going to get involved with. I'm going to join the parish council. The priest also has encouraged me to join the council.
This more Orthodox parish is what you're talking about.
It is,
with
yes,
the African priests. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So they he asked me to join the council, and I did. What it appears like the church was hemorrhaging middle-aged people. It was grandmothers taking grandchildren or great-grandmothers taking great-grandchildren. So there were some children there. Most of the adults, middle-aged adults, maybe they just went to the one mass that I wasn't attending. But the older crowd really had a foothold in there. And when I started attending their council meetings, I realized that they didn't want anything that I was sharing with them. Now, mind you, I came in like a bull in a china shop. I was like, you guys keep wanting to host these events. Why don't we fix the liturgy? And they just lost.
Wait, so you're actually not talking about the parish with the African priests then? You're talking about the...
I am. No.
Oh, you are? Okay.
I am. There were things that they would do, not the African priests. The priests were doing the best they could. So they offered a Holy Mass, but everything else, all the other things that put a Mass together, from, EMs dressing like, with the sandals and,
the mini skirts. You can't have EMs without mini skirts.
Just all of the cliches were happening there. And I was trying to, I honestly thought they wanted to get the church alive again. No stab at boomers, but they needed a breath of fresh air in there. And any suggestion I had really was met with a lot of anger. It started by the time, it was probably 2 years that I spent there solid. By the time I was ready to leave, I couldn't handle it anymore. I had exhausted every possible route I could to try to find a reason why I needed to stay there. My wife, on the other hand, she likes to be grounded. She's a nester. She loves to be in the nest. And she had the children there, and they were involved in, what's it called? RE, religious education, So I started, we would go to Mass on Saturday nights, and I would start going out on Sundays. And Sundays I would head to a different church and say, okay, let me feel it. I'm looking for a regular Mass. I'm looking for a Mass that isn't silly. And I found a bunch of them here in the Valley. But I would move on. I'd move into different locations, moving all throughout the Valley. And I have to throw out props to our bishop. Our bishop has got some solid footing, at least a foundation here for us. He's springboarding off of some of that insanity from the past. And he has, I think, calculated what locations he's going to build up in churches. And I would find some of those churches. And you could see the difference from maybe he put in newer priests or ones that were just more Orthodox. And that's, I started going to those different churches, and then I tried something closer to the house. And I have to say, I probably put in about a year of experimenting. And I think I made it to one, well, I'm not going to put out the name, but I found an FSSP church that I knew existed. And I had friends that talked about it, and I knew I needed to be there by this point. I had learned enough in the theology, and I started doing YouTube and finding videos of Father Rippinger and Sensius Fidelium, and it just, man, I just really started immersing myself. And I'm leaving out the most important part was I started prior to the president being elected. I started a rosary. I think it was, darn it, what's the priest back in Wisconsin? I think it's Heilman.
Well, yeah, Father Richard Heilman. Yep.
So he started a 54-day novena rosary. And I said, I'm doing this. And every night I would sit down and do it. And then the president was elected. And I said, I am not stopping doing this. because I was really concerned about Hillary Clinton. She is what I remember from New York. I'm not going to play politics, but she's that New Yorker that I served lunch to. It was never sitting at the dinner party,
Yeah.
but so I kind of knew what we were going to get into, and that rosary came in, and I started praying it daily. And when the 54 days were up, I continued, and I started getting a clarity, maybe 6 months, a year into this rosary, of where I felt I needed to be. I started saying to myself, why do you have to try to put up the fight? Why do you allow yourself to get frustrated to the piano and the violins? My goodness, the violins.
And the glad tambourines.
Well, they're out there, but those are starting to slip away, and the boomers I got. But the music, I started listening to people that knew more about theology than I did. And I started up that road. So Matthew Kelly and I started graduating to different levels, and then realized, okay, I think I have to move on or whatever. The most important part was that internally, I started living my faith the way I'm supposed to. I really wanted to eliminate mortal sin from my life. And it was the first time I ever recognized it. I believe the rosary is a pivotal point in that, because I started to really make some action moves that I had to clear up. I wanted to remain faithful to my wife, even in where society would say it wasn't a big deal. Where if a young girl or a woman walked by me, I would take custody of my eyes and struggle in those questions. Things like birth control and things. Those questions came up, and all of those other issues, social issues that really are kind of off the rails right now. Those questions came up one by one in my journey up until this point. I went to this one last, and I'll call it the Novus Ordo, but it was the unicorn that Tim Gordon always talks about. Beautiful music, beautiful liturgy, just a Novus Ordo. And I was there, and it's only about 5 minutes from this traditional Latin Mass in the Valley. So I said, why? Why not make the leap? Well, the day I chose to go there was the Feast of Corpus Christi. And I went to this Mass, and then there was the procession, and there was the chant. And it was like I ordered a supersize of this Mass. I got everything.
Yeah,
I wanted.
you did.
and I remember walking out of there like dumbfounded, like, what? Why am I not doing this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so all right, so let's pivot then. This is a good pivot point.
I feel like we're talking for hours, man.
No, but it's all good, because this is how the journey works, right? But let's pivot away from the personal story of how you got there to what you see going on in the church. You've been coming to the fraternity parish for a while now, but not exclusively. You kind of have your foot in both worlds. You go to the Novus Ordo parish sometimes. You go to the fraternity parish most of the time.
Well,
I see you there most Sundays.
My parish priest cut me out of that. That's a side note I should have probably talked to you about earlier. That's my the pastor at that Latin Mass suggested I not do the moonlighting that I have been doing. So I can get into what I've been doing. I'd like to talk about that side of my faith, and then get into the point where I'm going to be strictly, I want to go strictly to the Latin Mass.
Which I think is a good place to go, but I think that it still remains relevant because that's a recent development. It's safe to say that you're experiencing the more mainstream Catholic guys who are taking their faith more seriously, still living very much in the post-conciliar church. You've kind of got your foot in both worlds until very recently. And so what I want to know is, what is having that perspective of both worlds help you to see that maybe somebody like me who spends all their time in one, or somebody else who spends all their time in the other might not. I've been 16 years at the Latin Mass exclusively. Very, very, very rarely do I ever go to any other parish. So I mean, I started going before Summorum Pontificum. I started going when the Latin Mass was really ghettoized under the indult from John Paul II. There was not a lot of people going. And so I don't have the same perspective that you have of going back and forth between the two.
Okay.
And so what does that perspective give you in terms of understanding where things are in the church right now?
Okay, so going to the Crucio got me in touch with men, masculine men, authentic masculinity, and started exposing me to these people. These are guys I wanted to sit down and hang out with, smoke a cigar with, and really pick their brains about their faith, their struggles that they go through, and see where the similarities lie. So our diocese is blessed to have these men's conferences. They've been, I think they're up to 12. And I started going probably year 6. And they are the best version of Catholicism that we can get in a large scale. I mean, we're talking crowds of 2,600 in the past, and they're probably down more modestly to about 13, 12, around that area. And they're bringing in some headline speakers. But what you're witnessing is, at least what I witnessed, was that I'm not alone in this concern of a world. That I am living a chaste life, or I'm living the way God intended me to. And I be more virtuous, that I treat my children a little different than what I would have done had I just been a good dad. Using some biblical direction. So when I meet these guys, they're, that whole iron sharpens iron really kind of locks in with these guys. And it's only been getting better. The conferences are really starting to tighten up. The diocese that I live in right now is solid with respect to our bishops. We have 2 bishops, and we have a cathedral that does an online television show that they do their online mass, and the priests there are top notch. We have seminarians that are here, so we have a really fruitful, growing diocese, because our bishop is true to the faith. Now, am I expecting him to do Latin ad orientem? Probably not. But I don't begrudge him for not being that way. Now, I go into a Latin Mass and I fall in love. Here's this kid from Brooklyn. I walk past Lincoln Center all the time. I never knew the beauty that was going on inside of there. I would go to the garden. I'd go see concerts. I'd go by the Met. I'd see some art. But Lincoln Center had beautiful music that I was not privy to. And then I walk into this Latin Mass, and I kind of grew into it. I had the help of a friend, Maria. I had the help of a friend, Andy, that is currently in the seminary. And I had these questions that they were willing to answer that were the uncomfortable questions that I could not get answers to. And they would send me on this kind of scavenger hunt of finding media that would direct me into the honest question and be able to honestly answer, and then be able to make an honest decision on where I want to be. The Mass and the way the Mass is intended, with respect to the Novus Ordo, is always the argument. Any of my intelligent friends in the Novus Ordo will say that the Mass is beautiful and stuff. And I don't know how to sum it up with them, but I don't know how to describe it. It's like if you took an opera and had it in English, I guess. And you took, Rigoletto, and you had that go in English. It'd be good, it wouldn't be the same. You know, it wouldn't be exactly. You know, it'd be Rigoletto. It'd be everything you wanted it to be. Just that spark and beauty that was possessed in the Italian, or you know, just everything that flew and rode through that opera would be lost just because you switched it to English. A little simple thing like that. So the new mass, you know, people are arguing, oh, it's not executed right and stuff like that. And I started asking myself, why do I have to argue for this? I mean, that example is probably my best example, because instead of me arguing back and forth with you about why I can't find this unicorn mass, I just go to the old mass. And now I go to the old mass, and this is the one Joan of Arc went to. This is the one St. Thomas Aquinas went to. And I don't need to do all this research. See, you're a theologian, right? I'm not. I don't want to be. I love my faith. I love my God. I love my family. And the world is on fire right now. I just want to go to church. I want to go to be reverent. I want to give God what he deserves. And I want to give Jesus the respect that he deserves for doing the ultimate gift that he can give me, was sacrifice himself for that past life that I know I've already committed and for what I have yet to do. And I don't want to get into the gory details of it all. I just want to walk in, be reverent at Mass, kneel at the altar, receive the Holy Eucharist, leave with my family, crack a couple of jokes outside with you, and maybe get home and cook some dinner. I don't need the whole, I don't need everything.
You don't want to be a theater critic. You don't want to be going into every Mass going, was this what it was supposed to be?
I don't want to be ignorant either. I don't want to know about the play, or I don't want to know about the English version and the Italian version and still insist that the English version's better and try to find ways that it's better.
Yeah, I mean, and let's take it a step further, because I think your analogy is beautiful, and I also actually love opera. It was something that I came to appreciate later in my life than I probably should have, but it's not just like Rigoletto in English. It's Rigoletto in street. It's Rigoletto in like it's dumbed down. The Mass that we have in English, if you translate, I know you've looked at the missals of the Mass at the Fraternity Parish. The prayers aren't the same. The structure's not the same. The entire anthropology of worship, this idea of I'm coming here to this sacrifice of a sin oblation to God, where Christ is acting as priest and as victim, and he's offering himself to the Father through the power of the Holy Spirit. It's an ethos that's not there in the Mass that we grew up with, in the Mass that I grew up with, in the Mass that you grew up with. Like, we went to a meal. Sometimes it felt like it was a freaking barbecue or a picnic. Like, it was not. It was all about the fellowship, and it was not about the Holocaust in the true sense of the word, of a sin offering, which is what a Holocaust is. Christ was killed for our sins. He took our sins with him into the grave and redeemed us by that. And that's you don't get that when you're talking about a meal. It's a very different experience of going to Mass in according to the way I experience it. I don't know what you think.
I know a lot of people from my past that do not go to Mass anymore. I don't know why God chose me to go on this wonderful journey, but I know that I had to have been handpicked, because there's no way I would have figured this out on my own.
Right.
I don't give myself that much credit.
Same here.
So,
I didn't.
So my evidence is that I lost a lot of friends that I don't even want to try to start. This isn't like I don't want to make fun of a radio show that would ask questions that were Catholic, but I got friends at home that I want to be able to call and say, you don't understand all those years that we went through. just go to a Latin Mass. Everything will be good after like 2 years. You'll be good.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not going to solve every problem, but it's going to help clear up a lot.
Right.
And it creates its own. It creates a whole separate, complex set of issues that I have now, which is clarifying in my life how I need to live to be a better husband, better father, better man, to listen more. Things that the society has been telling me, get a YouTube channel, start a podcast. I'm starting to withdraw and fall back and listen because the Latin Mass has taught me that. And to your point of the Latin Missal, you sit down at the Latin Mass and the Mass starts on, whether you're a part of it or not. The bell rings, people it started. You have a Latin Missal in front of you and you're looking back and forth and you remember the new Mass, what they're saying. And then you see these words here and you see yourself, wow, it's a lot more complex. That's a simple answer. But when you actually are looking at it outside of Mass and you're actually reading the words, it's almost like I've been robbed of my birthright as a Catholic and as a baptized Catholic.
Yes. Yeah.
That's how I feel. I feel like I've been robbed, and now I feel like my battle doesn't exist among demons. It exists with trying to deculturalize my family, because the church up until I was 45, really kind of had me on a softer road. And now I look and I say, wait, the road is a lot harder, but there's a better chance of getting to purgatory, the clearer path to get to purgatory now. I'm not even, I'm shooting for sainthood, but I see that the actual, when you unwrap what the church offers and the complexity of it, you start to realize that I need to focus more with my family as far as theology, and it's almost like you're recatechizing yourself and your family.
So let's do this. Let's break it down at this point into some practical understandings. One of the things that I would like your perspective on is, how do people in the Novus Ordo parishes see the situation with the traditional Mass and traditionalists, in your view? Because it was a very foreign thing. When I made the switch, I was 27, 28, and I had gone to the Novus Ordo my whole life. And when I made the switch, Summorum Pontificum wasn't a thing. So you had to find an indult parish. They were hard to find. It was a very marginalized thing, going to the traditional Mass. But the minute I finally made the commitment that this is where I needed to go, I knew there was no looking back. But I also remember being the guy going to the Novus Ordo parish going, I don't get it. So from where you stand now, what do you think people are seeing, between these two forms of the Mass? The church tells us the extraordinary form and the ordinary form, and I hate these terms because I don't think they're good terms. But I mean, it's what we know. What do people see when they're looking toward the change that you've made?
Yeah, I struggle with the ordinary form and the extraordinary form. I struggle with all the different ways we have to describe what I found. The truth of the matter is that if I don't bring it up, it's not talked about. If I don't bring up the Latin Mass or the richness that they're missing or something like that, and I kind of learned early on that was not a conversation I really needed to have, and within the Novus Ordo community, I'm okay if they're on a good path. I don't need to evangelize them, and they don't really look at it as me being. It's almost like someone came to you with like what's that stuff called? Like network marketing. Someone's trying to sell you skin lotion or something like that. You're like, this dude bought this company. Now he keeps calling me about it. So I try not to even talk about it. What I realized was that I got better as a human, and I got better around my family because I found a lot of the answers that I needed answered, or a lot of the questions were answered. I would leave the Mass so stressed out, on a Saturday night vigil, because, the priest for the homily called up all the kids, and now he's evangelizing them. I'm like, dude, I'm struggling over here. I don't need you to talk to them to try to relay some message to me. And I found those things kind of frustrating. I found the simplicity that they were really they kept trying to spoon feed me a simple method for a really complex, faith. And that was just my bug out. But everybody else that's going there, I'm sorry.
No, I mean, you prompt the question of, doesn't it make you feel like, though? I mean, you mentioned you go to the Latin Mass and the bell rings and it starts and it's going, whether you're there or not, right? But the contrast is against going to the Saturday night vigil where they're pandering to kids, and maybe it's some, sort of roundabout way of reaching the people in the pews, but it's like, it's about you. It's about who they think the target audience needs to be. Where you go to the old Mass and it's just like, we're here for God, man. You can come or you can go, but like, this is the thing we're doing. We're here to worship God. And if you want to be a part of that, sweet, get in a pew, kneel down and do the thing.
If you've ever looked at any success in business, maybe even our president's books or something probably have it. There's always this talk about, someone on the rise to success. And I know you're a victim of it, or maybe a survivor of it, just looking at your Twitter account. That no one sees the work you put in to where you've gotten, to where, however far you've gone.
Right.
They just see you now as the guy on the top of the hill, and they want to knock you over. And I think there's some similarity, but not in that respect. But there's a similarity. If I don't bring up that Mass, I don't bring up the differences, because I found what I was looking for, and I'm going to grow there. And what I hope and pray for is that I'm going to lend a hand when the question is brought to me. It's to reflect back on some of my early days in AA. I'm not running to you and telling you you're an alcoholic because I found this program and I realized that you might have a drinking problem. I'm going to go to the program. I'm going to do the best I can. I'm going to get to know the names and faces. And when you show up, I'm going to have people that you come and meet. And I'm going to show to you that it's not just a bunch of people with no teeth sitting around smoking butts and, just kind of shooting the breeze, that there's actually some sort of nuance and some realities that are happening here that keeps you from picking up a drink. The same thing with the Novus Ordo. I love the people that they're 99, with the exception of you and someone else. I've got like a handful of people that I know in the Latin Mass, but I know my whole entire world is in the Novus Ordo.
Same here. My whole family, everybody. So
it's not really my job. At least it hasn't been something that God told me it's where I need to be. If he does a Samuel wake up in the middle of the night, this is time you do, I'm going to sing, "Here I am, Lord." I had to throw that in. But,
all right. Well, let's kind of wrap this up on a couple of questions that I think are important. So we see, you and I are experiencing this personally, watching this big migration that's happening towards the traditional parishes, right? Especially since the Vigano stuff came out in 2018. I don't know that we can pinpoint a single reason, but in the past year, there are news stories about this, right? Fraternity parishes are growing by double digits, by triple digits, 30%, 40%. Some parishes, I think the one out in Los Angeles has grown by 200%, right, in the last year or two. People are leaving conservative Novus Ordo parishes, and they're coming to traditional Latin Mass parishes for whatever reason they are. We don't necessarily know the reasons. I don't even know if they necessarily know the reasons. But they're showing up. So if you could give people who are interested in checking out the Latin Mass, the Latin Mass parish in their area or whatever, for the first time, some helpful advice, what would that be? And then the second piece to this is, for people who are going to Latin Mass, especially those who have gone for a long time, what advice would you give them? So it's a two-parter. It's a two-parter. And there's no pressure. This is a huge question. No pressure.
It's awesome. I'm loving it. The people in the Novus Ordo have a misconception of who is at the Latin Mass. Yes, you will see families with a lot of kids, but you also will see husbands and wives together. So in the Novus Ordo, you go into a Mass and you only see maybe one of the spouses, and you'll see one or two kids. You're going to see a large family there. And no one is looking at you and your 1-2 kids. And no one in the Latin Mass is interested in you in a negative way. It's probably the easiest way to put it. What I noticed was people were excited when they saw the newbie. All right, they saw the newness in your eyes. They saw the maybe the excitement of the. I remember people asking me, "Hey, is this your first Mass?" And it was my first Mass. And just like I compared it to rehabilitation groups, the people on the inside know, and they were once you. So the snottiness and snobbery that we kind of project, I think it really, from Novus Ordo, you do project this onto the Latin Mass people until you walk in the door. And then you realize that they're the same people that live next door to you that just found their way in there. That's my simple answer to the Novus Ordo. Now, to the Latin Mass people, it's going to sound like I'm contradicting the original. Get off the case of extreme piety. Focus on your own game and worry about your own salvation, because the people that are coming in the door, and they're going to come in like a storm, I believe, they're going to be in jeans. I know my wife went to her first Latin Mass. She wore dress pants because that's where she's comfortable, and she had no veil. And she felt really self-conscious about the veil, where the pants were probably the issue that women would have taken up with her. The difference is now that I've been going to the Mass, nobody was looking at her. So if you're at the Latin Mass and you're making an issue about it, you're the 1% of the congregation that's doing that. The same with, maybe not following along. I don't think any of that applies. I think the only thing I have with the Latin Mass is, and I have not experienced it myself, I have to add that caveat in there, is this extreme, someone commenting that you're not dressed appropriately. I've heard of issues of maybe shoulders, women wearing, we live in Arizona, it's 110 out, and women are wearing a dress that maybe they had spaghetti straps or whatever. I've heard of issues of shoulders, having a sweater over it and not covering up enough, or too much of the neck was showing.
Yeah.
I've heard of these horror stories, but I've never witnessed it, so I can't attest to it. But that would be my suggestion to the PLF.
Did you feel when you came like people welcomed you? And I mean, and I ask this as you know me now, and so there's a difference, but I'm pretty introverted. I'm not the guy who goes up and introduces myself to people. And I have the added, I don't know if I want to call it a detriment, but people tend to recognize me and they want to talk to me, and you've seen that happen. And it's like, I kind of withdraw from social circumstances sometimes, because it's like, I got 6 kids with me here and my wife, and, people are hungry and they want to go eat. And I'm talking to friends who I've known for a long time. But I do worry because I'm not that guy. Like, are people feeling welcomed? And I'll put this out there. I have had this theory for a long time that tradition, because it has been marginalized, because it's been ghettoized, it draws people from the margins. It draws people who are used to being somewhat social outliers. People who, you'll notice, like, there's an overrepresentation of, for example, people from technical fields at the traditional Mass. These are very highly intelligent people, but people we might ordinarily consider somewhat nerdy. And there's this sense of, I don't care what other people think of me. I'm used to people thinking I'm weird or whatever. But I think that because tradition has been pushed to the extreme, you don't get all the type A personalities. You don't get all the social connectors. You don't get all the people that you would have gotten when this was the normative Mass for everyone. And so there's a little bit of an imbalance, socially speaking, when you go to the Latin Mass. It's a different crowd than you would get if you go to the conservative Novus Ordo parish in the diocese. I don't know. What do you think of that? I mean, is it off? Did you feel like...
I think you might have... I think that might be an issue that is going away.
Okay.
Because when we... So, I gave you a really quick version of us going to the Mass, but I went one Sunday to a high Mass with my wife, my son, and daughter at the time. And it was a high Mass, and it blew us away, and we were intimidated. So we walked in the door, and there were dads that came up to me and introduced themselves and just said, welcome, and first Mass, don't worry, just watch. Don't pick up the book, just, a lot of pointers. And the women, same thing, smiled at my wife, talked to her, and said, hey, that's great. I'm glad you came by. This is the local parish here. I don't know if that's like that across the country or across the world.
I have to say my experience of this parish here is that we've got a lot of really great people here. A lot of very, very social people. We have a great crowd here.
Yeah, it's solid. And, I met you. I met one of my friend Eddie, Doug. I met these guys outside of the church, and it's very funny that I was introduced to a friend of mine who is he's at the cathedral. He invited me out, and I got to this guy's house, and the guy looked familiar, and we realized we go to the same church together. So it's kind of funny. I'm like, why does this guy look familiar? Because it is a smaller community. But what I do notice is that people are looking out for each other. They're looking out for each other's children. And not that it's not happening at the new Mass. I just know people are trying to get out the door, and it's more of a parking lot fight. I'm going to stereotype it that way. But some of the stuff you said, there's truth to it. There's a lot of introverts, and I'm kind of an extrovert, but there's a healthiness to it that I think my friends in the Novus Ordo would really appreciate. I know I have.
Yeah.
I have friends.
I'm excited to see new people coming, people who are more extroverted, people who are more the kind. I mean, my friend Eddie, who I've been friends with for over 20 years, who introduced you to me, hasn't been going to the Latin Mass for as long as I have. He hasn't been going to this parish for as long as I have, but he's a social connector. And so he introduced you to me, even though you and I may have been there before he was even going. I don't even know. But it's like, I'm really happy to see those people there because it's creating a community. And I think that's a big deal. So I want to ask you because, we've talked about a lot of stuff. Do you have any concluding thoughts on all this that you kind of want to leave people with before we go?
Yeah, I do. I wish there was an intermingling. The problem with it all flows one way. We want the people from the Novus Ordo to go to Latin Mass. I would love it if people from the Latin Mass that have been, the ones that have not left, to go back to the new Mass, because there's got to be, not so much as a penance, but almost as an aid to the people that are there, because there's holy people at the new mass, and there's a lot of misunderstanding of theology in the new mass as well. And I don't mean it 100%, but I wish the two worlds would just kind of blend in together, because those people in the new mass, they're not like the same way Jesus said that, shake the dust of that town, These people know me. I'm not going to be able to get much further than if someone outside of their circle met them and said, well, I do the Latin Mass also. Because the thing is that right now, currently, and it's taboo to talk about. It's still underground in a way. I'm almost, I'm almost concerned that I haven't been exposed to it. I assume I'm going to be now, but I haven't been exposed to any of the problems of the new mass. Some of the problems that leaving the new mass and going to the Latin mass. But I feel that there's just some feelings of that. There's an abandonment. And I'm going to fall back on Tim Gordon again, talking about the new Coke and the classic Coke is a clear image of what that is. And now people are drinking a new Coke and they're saying, yeah, I like it. It's all right. It's been forced on our throat for so many years. And this is not a personal issue about bishops or priests or all that stuff aside, all the personal stuff aside. It's just bad business. It just doesn't work, in my opinion. And I will have a very good friend of mine, godfather to my new baby daughter, that he'll argue up and down about the new mass and the legitimacy of it. And I've never, ever bashed the legitimacy of it, but the authenticity of it.
And what did he think, though? Because your new daughter was baptized in the old rite. What did he think of that?
He loved it. He was blown away. He was blown away by it, and he's open to it. But
because this is the thing that I think people don't understand. This isn't about us. This is the way our grandparents and our great-grandparents and our great-great-grandparents worshipped. This is, like you said earlier, I mean, this is our birthright. This is what Catholicism was. We're not doing some weird thing. We're not doing some new thing. We're doing the old thing that people always did. And the new thing that we were given, like so many other new things that were given. I mean, you remember when cars lasted for 20 or 30 years and you didn't have to get a new one until they were like, hey, we could make it so this thing breaks down every 5 to 10 years and you've got to get a new one. We were given a new thing and it wasn't as good. It wasn't as durable as the old thing. That cliched saying of they don't make things the way that they used to. They don't make the Mass the way that they used to. That's all we're saying. We're just rediscovering the thing that this treasure. We're uncovering orthodoxy. We're recovering the thing that all Catholics had for hundreds, thousands of years, and that's it. Like it's just Catholic. That's all it is.
Friends from the new Mass will tell me, the new Mass done correctly. The Vatican II. Done correctly, and then you hear the other side of the spirit of Vatican II. The people that are trying to twist it, and that spirit of Vatican II is stronger than the Vatican II done correctly. I'm not against a Novus Ordo Mass done correctly. The problem is that you can't. It's going to take generations to have a priest.
That's only because we haven't pulled you fully to the dark side yet, Kenny. Give it time.
Oh, I am. Trust me, I am there. It's only because they stick the traditional Latin masses in the darkest part of town.
Yeah, they put them in the worst places, and yet they're so full that we can't fit everybody inside.
They bury them in this. You're almost like you got junkyard dogs.
Yeah.
Chasing you, and you still, I'm content with it. I'm all right with it. These are my catacombs. It just really solidifies why I go there in the first place. If I'm going to die for the faith, this is the image I want in my head while I'm losing it. This is the one I want. I don't want pastels, and I don't want, what are all the cliches? The felt
banners and Jesus is a butterfly from the mountain and all that.
Gather your people, O Lord. Yeah,
Lord of the dance.
There was interesting observation about music that I always, music was kind of something that all my life they always said, you needed this modern music. And then I think it was on the Terry and Jesse show, they talked about it being the new music is horizontal, where the Gregorian is vertical, and it's from us to God, not from us to us, and there's so much truth to that. They do make me tap my feet. People say, "Oh, you don't like the music?" No, I didn't say I didn't like the music, but when I'm cleaning my living room and I'm trying to move couches, I'm all right with that music playing. It kind of it steers me away from some of the stuff I would listen to in my youth. It keeps me focused because there's a value in it still, and maybe that's what my message is to the TLM people. There's still some value that's coming out of the mess, and that we just can't completely write it off. I don't want to be a snob. I want to be, someone that is assisting the faith through this really tumultuous time. I don't want to be a hindrance, and I don't want to be a guy swinging at insane arguments. I don't want the arguments. I just want to be a holy Catholic man with a holy Catholic family, and I just want to have holy Catholic funeral requiem, funeral when I die. I want them in black, boy. That's what I want.
Yeah, no, I mean, in this case, once you go black, you never go back. Right? Let's end it on that. I mean, we're not even going to mess with the entendre, because seriously, if you've ever been to a Requiem Mass and seen the black vestments and read the prayers of that Mass, there's no way. There's no way you can ever go back. You can't.
No way.
I'll never forget.
I love my people on both sides of the fence right now. I love Novus Ordo and I love the trads. I love what I'm going through, and I would love for more people to join me, but I am not going to drag them, because I wasn't dragged there. I was led there.
You were.
So that's my.
That's your story, and you're sticking to it.
So far.
Hey, Kenny, it's been great to talk to you about all this stuff. I really appreciate you coming on.
I really thank you for listening. It's really nice that I got to put my voice out there and maybe shout for the other guys on the other side of the field.
Yeah, man, your voice is an important voice, and your story is an important story. So thanks for telling it.
All right, praise God. Thank you.
All right.
Well, that's all the time we have for this episode of the OnePeterFive podcast. I want to thank you for tuning in. Please remember, if you're watching this on YouTube, to like this video, to subscribe to our channel, to share this video with your friends. If you are listening on iTunes or Stitcher or Google Podcasts, please subscribe to us there. Leave a review if you can. It helps other people to find our content. And then, as always, if you enjoy the work that we do, we ask that you please make a modest financial contribution in support of our work at OnePeterFive.com/donate. We are a completely reader, listener, and viewer supported enterprise. Thank you so much for listening, for watching, and we'll see you next time.